It's been quite a while since episode 1. In fact, over a year that is. But now, finally, welcome back to the Automobilista 2 track tier list ranking, whatever you want to call this. Last time we looked at tracks from South America, and today we're going to talk about the European tracks in the game. As before, kart tracks will not be included, and we're gonna judge the tracks by using cars that you'd most likely probably see racing at these tracks, so I won't judge Snetterton in an F1 car, for example. Also, some of these tracks have multiple layouts, but I'm only going to judge the modern ones. Classic ones might get their own episode one day, probably in about 10 years or so if I continue at this pace. And if there's one very good layout, some more boring layouts won't impact the overall rating. And of course, these ratings are my subjective opinion. Feel free to share yours in the comments down below. So, once again, we're going through the countries alphabetically. We start in Austria, and of course, we're talking about the Red Bull Ring in Spielberg here. The track overall can be summarized as being pretty good. Racing here is a blast with overtaking possibilities aplenty, and I feel the track is quite beginner friendly, though hard to master. It's not the most complicated layout, and I feel the biggest challenge of this track is avoiding track limit warnings. That is of course in its modern version with all deep tarmac runoff. The racing makes more than up for it though. Loads of elevation change and some good flow towards the end of the lap, plus the scenery put this track into B tier for me. Continuing with Belgium, Spa-Francorchamps more precisely, and I think we can keep this really short. Everything that can be said about this track has been said already. It is one of those fantastic, spectacular classic venues that has kept a lot of character even after many modifications. It's good for racing, has a fantastic flow, high speeds, many overtaking possibilities, and it's a staple on any real and virtual race calendar. The only minus I can find is that it can get a little old if every online lobby is using this track. Like, come on! There's more to online racing games than Spa or Monza. Still, that's not the track's fault, so that's a slam dunk S tier track. And we're keeping it legendary as we head from Belgium to their neighbors France, where the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans take place. Now, here might be the first bit of controversy, so let me get this out of the way. I love Le Mans, I really do, and the 24-hour race there is one of my personal highlights of every year, but to me, it is the status of this race that makes this event special. Sure, the track plays an important part here too, and it's a pretty good one, but to be honest, it is not on a level with Spa for me. The Porsche curves are awesome, the opening part is awesome, Indianapolis and Arnage are too, but the rest is just endlessly long straights with chicanes. They are certainly very good for racing or navigating traffic, but if you're on your own, they're not really that spectacular. After all, they're long straights and chicanes. The Circuit Bugatti is also included in Amos too, but to be honest, that track is okay, but nothing to write home about. Still, I'm very glad they included it. So, I'm giving Le Mans an A. Now, go ahead and slaughter me in the comments how I dare not put an S here. Still continuing with bordering countries, we are heading to Germany, where we for the first time have more than one track in Amos too. The first one is my local racetrack, the Hockenheim Ring. Also, not the most complicated of tracks, but in my opinion, a bit more challenging and harder than Spielberg, even if it's flat as a pan. The racing though does not suffer and just works with almost every kind of cars, even modern F1 cars, and that really is something. And while the modern layout is not as unique as the old super high-speed blast through the forest, it still has some of these old elements, especially in the last sector where mistakes are actually being punished. Just ask Sebastian Vettel. So, a bit of a reminder that my opinion here might be biased, but I am giving an A to Hockenheim. Now to a track that is a bit of a nemesis to me, mainly because it was Hockenheim's main opponent in hosting an F1 race in Germany for many years. And that of course is the Nürburgring. Now, I have to be honest here, for hot lapping, I even think the GP track might be a bit better than Hockenheim for racing purposes though. Hockenheim is slightly ahead, and the Mercedes arena on the Nürburgring is just such a pain in my opinion. So In total, I'd say the GP tracks are on quite a similar level, but what really steals the show in favor of the Nürburgring is, of course, the Nordschleife. And that track has its status for a reason. I actually tried to become a bit more comfortable with the track last winter, where I did a short version of the 24 hours in GT3 cars, and I also made a short video talking about the history of this track, and although this really hurts personally, I have to put the Nürburgring ahead of the Hockenheim ring in S tier. Everything else would be a disservice to the Nordschleife. Next up, Italy, and once again we have two tracks to choose from. The first one is Imola. That track is properly old school in terms of both width and runoff. While I personally think it shouldn't be on the F1 calendar anymore, as it simply does not work well with modern Formula 1 cars, which is more the fault of the cars than the track, it still is fantastic with other types of cars. Loads of challenging corners, elevation changes, fantastic flow, except for Variante Alta, which I simply do not really like all that much. In total, I think I'd give Imola an A, albeit a very high A, but it is simply not quite S tier material for me. And now to the proper star of Italian motorsport venues, the Autodromo Nazionale di Monza. Now, to be very honest, I find this one particularly hard to rank, as once again, it's not the most complicated of tracks, but oh my, is the racing here good, and still, it has iconic corners, the Parabolica, Curva Grande, the Lesmos, and of course the challenging, easy to get wrong Ascari chicane. Della Roggia and the Retifilia chicane might not be the greatest corners in the world, but they are fantastic overtaking opportunities and guarantee lots of action. And after having said something very positive about every single corner of this track, Monza might not be so hard to rank after all. Get into S tier, mate. From one legendary venue to another as we hit the streets of Monaco, or how they are called in AMS2, the Azure Circuit. This track is controversial in modern F1 to say the least, certainly one of the hardest tracks on the calendar, but definitely one of the worst on a Sunday. But once again, it's the cars that are the issue. The very same track has produced some fantastic racing in Formula E, and since you have such a broad variety of cars in AMS2, you'll definitely find cars that can also race here very well. In fact, even when I raced F1 cars here in AMS2, it was a pretty exciting event. And I strongly recommend you to check out the races of my current Dream F1 season and the 2011 F1 season on this channel, as these races were absolute bangers in my opinion. Anyway, I won't award Monaco an S, but I think, as a track in general, not as an F1 track, it deserves an A. Automobilista 2 is known for featuring some quite unusual tracks for sim racing titles, and while there were a lot of them in our first episodes where I covered the South American tracks, here is the first unusual track in Europe. Now, Cascais, or more commonly known as Estoril, is a track that unfortunately has been a bit forgotten in modern times, which is quite astonishing as it hosted Formula 1 rounds annually from 1985 to 1996, almost the same period as Adelaide. But somehow there are not many racing series that still come here, especially since Portugal has Portimao nowadays, which kind of became the new #1 in Portugal in terms of racetracks, and to be honest, that is a bit sad since Estoril is not a bad of a racetrack at all. Now, in all honesty, yes, I also prefer Portimao over this one, but it still is very good. Yes, it has lost some character with some of the latest modifications, even though the modern Turn 1 is probably a lot better for racing than the old spectacular high-speed version. And the makeshift chicane installed in 1994 still being there also is a bit of a pain, but apart from that, I think it's a good track. Furthermore, AMS2 also includes a modern version that leaves that chicane out, using the quite fast right-hand corner instead. All that is enough for me to award it a B rating. Interestingly, Estoril still holds the FIA Grade 1 rating, so it could even hold F1 races at any time. I certainly hope for some actual bigger racing series to return to Estoril. My Dream F1 series will certainly be in autumn this year. We stay on the Iberian Peninsula and go to Spain, where another two tracks await their very subjective rating, and the first one is the Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya. This is a bit of an odd one. Is it a very popular racetrack? Probably not. Whose fault is that? Well, that's hard to tell. Is it F1 because their cars also outgrew the track lately? Is it that horrible chicane in the final sector that finally is gone now? Is it the final sector in general that disrupts the flow of an otherwise good racetrack? Or is it boring F1 races due to too much data existing for the teams, since this was the F1 testing venue up until 2 or 3 years ago? Well, the answer to me is probably all of those things. That being said, I think without that chicane, it is probably the best option for F1 to race in Spain. Yes, also including you, new Madrid parking lot atrocity. You're worse than any of the other Spanish Grade 1 circuits. And there is 4 of them. And up until that final sector, in my opinion, Barcelona is A-tier material. I will have to downgrade it to B because of that, but honestly, I don't think it's a bad track at all, and I predict people want to have it back quite quickly in F1 after we went to the Madrid Convention Center. Jerez is quite the opposite, because it's now quite popular after it left the limelight that is F1, and yes, nostalgia can make you forget a lot of things. Just look at how popular Magny-Cours is among F1 fans nowadays. But I totally get it. Jerez has quite some good flow and lots of exciting corners. With the right cars, you can also have some brilliant races here, and to be honest, it's a bit more challenging and old school than Barcelona, which I like. And the best thing, it doesn't have a terrible final sector to ruin it. Jerez gets an A from me. Here comes the European country with the most tracks in Aimers 2, because no matter how hard you try to escape us mainland folks, you'll always be a part of us. And to be honest, you could do worse, right? And the UK brings so much value in terms of racetracks to our continent that we surely can't do without. The first of these is Brands Hatch, a fantastic circuit for a variety of cars and series. It just has such a great flow, so many challenging corners, elevation change, and great atmosphere generally. Now, once again, it does not quite come close to Spa-Francorchamps levels, but still, Brands Hatch is a very high A. Great that the track is still visited by many racing series. Cadwell Park. Well, what do we make of this? I know it has its fans, to which I unfortunately don't quite count myself to. On paper, it should be good. Nice flow, elevation change, challenging, but somehow I never clicked with Cadwell Park. Maybe I just can't get past the fact that this is more or less just a club circuit and not suitable for any major modern cars. But even with smaller ones, racing here is just not great for me. I mean, even with these small Ginettas, there barely is room for 2 cars to go side by side. For hot laps, this track is probably pretty good, but I don't know, man. I just never really have the urge to use this track, to be honest, not even in time trial. I am giving it a vague C just because on how I feel about it, very well aware that the problem here sits probably in the car and is not just everything around it. Donington is up next, and I have to admit, for a very long time I didn't really like this track. But now, when driving it, I'm always asking myself, why was that ever the case? Probably it was just some trauma from DTM Race Driver 2, or Tokyo Race Driver 2, where I always struggled here as a kid, but probably I was just too bad. I may still be, but at least I can now get a big amount of joy racing on this track. A proper old school track with natural track limits, a great flow, really working well with the elevation, and just absolutely brilliant with touring cars. For that purpose, in fact, probably the best circuit in the UK. Still, just outside of S tier for me, joining Brands Hatch in A. Oulton Park, well, this rather is a track for smaller national series, but for that purpose, it's quite good. You can actually properly race here, other than at Cadwell Park. It's one of those tracks where you're racing quite a lot at the beginning of career modes in racing games that have one in them. And I must admit, that this track has its charm, especially with the right series to drive here, but other than that, I must say it's alright. Oulton Park lands in B tier for me. It's nice to have a few tracks rather used on a national level in the game too, I must say though. But back to the showstoppers and Grade 1 tracks, as here is arguably the racetrack in the United Kingdom nowadays. And rightfully so. Silverstone is one of the few tracks that always stayed top-notch as a venue, no matter how many layout changes there were. In fact, also one of the few tracks where I say the more modern layouts are better than the very original ones, because, believe it or not, the spectacular Maggots and Beckett sequence was not there in the first place. Even the latest changes in 2010 weren't too bad. In fact, I think in terms of F1 racing, the track is now better than ever. And I think I've said this when ranking all F1 tracks ever in Codemasters F1 games. It manages to be such a brilliant track without any major elevation change or landmark. You hear that, kiddy? You don't need a 20-story high corner to build a fantastic track, though it probably helps glossing over the poor human rights records of Saudi Arabia. Anyways, back to Silverstone, that absolutely deserves into S tier for me. And now, the final track of the UK, and indeed the final track of this episode, and what better venue to finish this video with than Snetterton. And this is quite curious, because it just shows how different things can develop. Snetterton, like Silverstone, once was a military airbase, and the original 50s version of both tracks also weren't too different as a result. But Silverstone became the first host of a race that belonged to a certain series called Formula 1 World Championship, while Snetterton rather remained a testing venue. And while Silverstone therefore was developed immensely, Snetterton, while also experiencing remodels and changes to its layout, never really made it out of the national racing levels. The layout, while providing some challenge, especially on the latter part of the track, is not the most inspired one that goes for the traditional 200 layout, but also for the newer 300 layout that pretty much just turns in on itself a bit. I can't bring myself to give this track any higher rating than D, to be honest, but what I must say is a nice touch are the corner names here, acknowledging some of the greatest motorsports names in history like Senna, Hamilton, Williams, Brundle, Palmer, and of course Bombhole, who I suppose must have been some British racing talent that never quite made it to the top level. Well, and that's it for episode 2 of all tracks in AMS2 Ranked. In episode 3 we're heading to North America, which will probably come out in, well, 3 years. In the meantime, feel free to check out other AMS2 content on my channel, where I recreate historic seasons of Formula 1 and other motorsport seasons such as DTM 92 or Dream F1, where I started to create a different 12-team Formula 1 timeline beginning in 2022. Other than that, leave a like if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to not miss any upload on this channel, and see you all in, probably 3 years. Goodbye!